So today, in addition to Bill as our speaker, we have some special guests. The Flying Tigers flight attendants of the Vietnam War. You've probably heard of them. If you haven't, you're going to learn a lot more about them in a little bit. I'm going to introduce Marilyn Breen, who's going to come up here first to talk to you. Marilyn. Marilyn was born on the prairie of eastern Colorado to Swedish immigrants. As a 5-year-old, she moved with her family to a small town of Idaho Springs in the foothills of the Rockies. There she was educated through high school. Eyes constantly on the horizon, she moved to Denver, attended business college, and took night classes at Regis College. After a few years, that horizon was still in the distance, so she moved to San Francisco and found her dream job with the Flying Tiger Line in 1964. Second grade geography had taught her to seek other lands, and now at last she had that opportunity. She spent the next 28 years in the employment of Flying Tigers, working as a flight attendant and instructor and seeing these other lands. She is the widow of Henry Breen, whom she lost in 2013. She has 2 stepsons, 2 step-grandchildren, and 5 great-grandchildren. She enjoys the San Francisco Ballet as well as the San Francisco Giants. Please welcome Marilyn Breen.
Thank you, Russell. By the way, it's going to be a little hard act to follow here from Bill. Thank you, Bill. Anyway, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and all of distinguished guests. My name is Marilyn Breen, and I'm happy to represent the Flying Tiger flight attendants with me here today. They all join me in extending a warm welcome to this great ship, the Hornet. It's an honor to be here. We do want you to know that we are more used to welcoming people aboard a different type of vehicle. Our script would read something like this. Good evening, we would like to welcome you on board your Flying Tiger flight 575. We will be departing Cameron Bay in just a few minutes. Our destination will be McChord Air Force Base, Tacoma, Washington, United States. And we would get a big round of applause with that. The announcement on the opposite direction, not so much. I know some of you are familiar with the history of this airline, but for those of you confused about the name and the purpose of the airline, I would like to introduce my friend and fellow former flight attendant of Flying Tigers, Martha, and she's going to give you a brief chronology of the Flying Tigers. Martha?
Well, you've probably all seen pictures of these airplanes with the teeth painted across their noses. Well, those airplanes were piloted by some very young and daring Americans who had been recruited by retired Army Air Corps Colonel Claire Chennault. They look kind of like this. Prior to America's entrance into World War II, China was in a fierce battle with the Japanese and were having a tough time of it. Chiang Kai-shek was the head of the Chinese national government and enlisted the help of Chennault to recruit trained American pilots to help fly missions against those formidable Japanese and their dreaded Zeros. Chennault did recruit young men from the military as well as civilian life, and the group went to Burma as the first American volunteer group, the AVG. During their training on the P-40s, they were under the impression that the Japanese were terrified of sharks and that the Japanese held the tiger in great esteem as a symbol of strength. So with a smile on their faces, they had tiger shark teeth painted on their aircraft. We'll scare them to death, they laughed. Well, scare them they did. Probably not just because they had shark teeth on their noses, but they were feared because of their flying ability. The reckless strategy and plain old bravery of the young, many of them were designated ace, including this young daredevil. The designation ace is given when 5 enemy planes have been destroyed. He became an ace on Christmas Day, 1941, when he shot down 5 enemy aircraft over Rangoon by flying into a formation of Japanese bombers. Here's Duke Hedman in his Flying Tiger Line captain's uniform. And this is the Duke that we knew and we all loved. He was a wonderful gentleman. A cute story about Duke is he was hired as an advisor on the film Flying Tigers. He was hired as an advisor starring John Wayne. According to the story, Wayne so admired him that he started calling himself Duke. He may have taken the name, but John Wayne could not hold this Duke's coattails. When America declared war on Japan in 1941, this group was inducted into the U.S. Army Corps, and most remained so until the war ended in 1945. Upon their return to civilian life in California, Bob Prescott convinced 5 of his fellow AVGs to pool their money. They then sought funding from 4 rich investors, one an oil tycoon who dabbled in greenhouses and wanted a way to get his fresh California flowers to the East Coast. And the first air freight company was born. They bought a couple of surplus Bud Conestogas and called themselves the National Skyway Freight Company. Soon they got permission from Chenault to change the name to the Flying Tiger Line, and it remained such until 1989, when FedEx bought the entire airline with airplanes, routes, employees, and that era ended with sadness to everyone who was ever associated with this company. It wasn't a job, it was a love affair. But let's go back to the 40s. Bob, Duke, and the others scraped and scrounged for any business they could get. Pilots not only flew the airplanes, but they also loaded cargo and begged everyone they knew to fly their flying freight via FTL. We're not sure where the expression wing and a prayer originated, but it could have come from that early group. They became the can-do airline. Their motto was, we fly anything, anywhere, anytime, and they would do anything to move an airplane. Rules and regulations were sometimes modified to an occasion. 4 engines, perfect. 3 engines, can do. 2 engines, press on. 4 engines, no engines, pray. I can tell you from personal experience, they might not have survived without duct tape and chewing gum. But they were always innovative and energetic and refused to give in. Over the years, they survived and thrived, and they have flown anything, anywhere, at all times. They have flown entire circuses with their elephants. They flew elephants. They've flown celebrities such as Elsie the Borden cow and Shamu the killer whale. Anything. The flight attendant group came about with the story of their first military contract in 1946. The military insisted that they have the capability to fly passengers as well as freight. So they said, sure, we can do that. They hired some nurses, bought some surplus uniforms from Pan American, showed them an airplane, a DC-3 at that time, and said, fly. And they flew. The Korean baby lift, moving military families to new assignments, any number of charters. Now let's fast forward to January the 30th, 1968. The Tet Offensive begins. And that is the reason we're gathered here today, to remember all of you unsung heroes who served in that war. Tigers acquired the stretch version of the Douglas DC-8, which held 219 of you and 5 of us. along with a captain, co-pilot, navigator, and flight engineer. They hired hundreds of flight attendants and transferred us to Tacoma, Washington, and we joined other major airlines to become part of the Freedom Birds. We're here today to bring the wishes of hundreds of others who served on these Freedom Birds to let you know we have never forgotten you. On a couple of occasions, several of us have journeyed to the Vietnam Memorial on the grounds of the state capitol to hold a service in your honor. We will never forget. And so once again, as we said so many times when landing on U.S. soil from that place, welcome home. Thank you.
Well, if that piqued your interest, you can go to your web browsers and just write in Flying Tiger Line or Flying Tigers AVG. There's a plethora of information about this incredible, the history of this airline. It's really fun, and it's fun to read about. I want to invite you all over to the table over there. We've got some handouts, and if you have any questions about us or what we did during the war, we're happy to answer your questions. If we don't know the answers, we'll just lie. We're can-do. But seriously, a couple of years ago, somebody asked me to write an essay about what it was like to work on flying troops in and out of Vietnam. And at first, I didn't think I could do it because I didn't know my memory was that good. But I sat down and it wrote itself. And if you, with your indulgence, I will read that to you now. It has been over 50 years since I was flying troops into and hopefully out of Da Nang, Bien Hoa, and Cam Ranh Bay in South Vietnam. It's crazy how the memory can focus in such detail on certain conversations and certain faces while ignoring some of the more important facts. It is with these memories that I reflect on my feelings 50 years after being so involved in this conflict. When first we began to fly young men in uniform into Vietnam, I didn't really think much of it. The United States had begun to escalate the war, but most citizens at that time were unsure where Vietnam was, and they didn't really care. Not that we were oblivious to the fact that these young men to whom we were serving beef or chicken would soon be slogging through some foreign jungle in the hopes of not being killed. We knew they were going to war, but managed to keep our spirits up with the patriotic belief that American bravery and superior strength of body and mind would prevail. After a few months, it began to get a little more difficult because the men themselves were not quite as full of bravado as they had been. More news was getting out that this was a tough battle, and these men, children really, might not be coming home in a year. Time passed, the war escalated, and it became more difficult to say goodbye to these boys as they deplaned in that blindingly hot climate. The heat and humidity permeated the aircraft the instant the main cabin door was opened. As these boys passed us on the way out the door, they tried to keep a cheery, "Thanks for the ride." More often than not, I simply had to duck into the cockpit and ask the navigator or the flight engineer to stand in my place and smile. My choking voice and tears would not have been the best thing for them to see as they headed out to their assignments. It was very difficult to form words like "good luck" or "see you soon." Anything you could say was just inane. It's interesting how the demeanor of these boys changed as they got closer to Nam. The journey took them from the west coast of the United States to Anchorage, Tokyo, or Okinawa, and then the last leg into Vietnam. We as crew would be with them for one of these legs and then crew change at each point. When the plane took off from the U.S. soil, they were lighthearted and seemed to be off on a real adventure. The long leg between Anchorage and Japan, they mostly slept, and the last leg into Vietnam, they became quiet and introspective. We all knew what was on their minds. As the war grew in intensity, we flight attendants felt more queasy, knowing that so many of them would not be returning. We mostly used humor and pretended lighthearted banter to try to ward off their fears and our uneasiness. For those who could not sleep on that long flight, they would want to sit in the galley and chat or play cards. Sometimes that was a burden because we wanted to take a break ourselves. But almost unflinchingly, these young women did their best to chat with those GIs who would not see another American woman for over a year, and some maybe never. It sounds a little maudlin, but it was a fact, and we flew with it for 4 years or more. Coming out of Vietnam was a different story entirely. There was no predicting the mood or the feeling of the troops that were coming straight out of the jungle and going back to the world, as they called home. Some were cheerful and raucous as the wheels left the ground. Some just gazed out the window and said nothing. Some were actually belligerent and demanding. It was unpredictable and equally as sad as the fear shown by those who had just arrived in country. Again, we had to call on our humor and attempt at laughter to help them work up the courage to overcome the fear of the flight. Superstition pervaded the airplanes. And later, the fear of facing the protesters back home. So many of them asked questions about the mood of the country or wanted our opinion of how bad it was. The trick was to tell them the truth without sugarcoating, and try to explain that they probably wouldn't be encountering any large mobs. We worked hard. Those were long, grueling flights, both physically and emotionally. But we were a hardy bunch of young women, and most of us had adventurous spirits, which is why we took the job. Along with the emotions of what we were doing for a living, we were partying hard and taking solace in the friendships that we formed among ourselves. So many of those friendships have lasted over 50 years. We took part in an incredible piece of history. Whatever society's opinions, right, wrong, or indifferent to this human tragedy, we did what we thought was right. We like to think we provided some comfort and lighthearted spirit to the boys we took over and the men we brought back. Thank you.
Thank you, ladies.
Press on. No engine spray.
Pray. Can do.
Okay, real quick though, everybody, why don't you just give your first name and we'll let you go.
I'm Deb.
Marilyn.
Martha.
Thank you.
Ava.
Karen. Oh, I'm sorry.
Ava. Holly. Judy. Judy.
Joan.
Kathy.
Hi, I'm Sherry. Hi, Don. We love you.
And your first name?
Georgianne. Sherry.
The bird.
There he is. Perfect. Will, you should have had it on video, audio, or something.
Video? I need a script. Oh,
This is how we entertain ourselves. Come on, guys.
I'm Josie.
And 1, 2, 3.
No idea. They don't want you to know that, 3,000 of them shoot. But these were I thought it went well. Thought it went well.
Yeah.
I could be